For thousands of years, across the dense rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, the mist-covered Appalachian valleys, and the storm-laden coasts of the North American continent, countless generations of native peoples lived in a world shaped not by electricity or synthetic fabrics, but by raw nature itself. Rain was not an occasional visitor, it was a permanent part of the landscape. Storms could last for days, sometimes rolling in from the ocean with a low growl like distant drums, washing over entire tribes in sheets of cold water. In places like coastal Alaska or the wet forests of Washington, the skies could remain clouded for weeks, leaving everything slick, soaked, glistening, or dripping. Yet within this environment, indigenous communities did more than simply adapt. They developed an intimate, almost spiritual relationship with the elements. They learned the personality of the rain when it would come, how it moved, what it meant, and how to live in harmony with it rather than against it. What makes this remarkable is not simply that they survived. Many civilizations have survived harsh conditions. What sets Native American ingenuity apart is the effortless mastery with which they interacted with the natural forces around them. Without any modern waterproof fabrics, without mass-produced tools, without industrial strength shelters, these communities learned how to stay bone dry even when rain fell endlessly, even when rivers flooded trails, even when storms battered the coastline. They observed, experimented, and passed down knowledge through storytelling and teaching. This was knowledge not written in books, but carved into memory, inherited through tradition, preserved through lived experience. Imagine a world where every step you take is on damp earth. The forest floor is dark and spongy. The air smells like cedar and moss. Mist curls through the branches of enormous ancient trees older than any known kingdom, standing like guardians watching centuries unfold. The people who lived beneath these trees understood that the forest was not simply a backdrop. It was a partner in survival. They knew how different types of bark felt beneath the hands, how cedar peeled away in layers, how spruce roots twisted with strength, how animal hides behaved when wet, and how fat, resin, and fibers reacted to water. These were not random observations. These details, tiny to an outsider, were essential to the complex knowledge system that kept entire nations warm and dry. When the first explorers reached the Pacific Northwest, they were stunned to see local tribes walking through downpour after downpour without appearing bothered. Their clothing, woven from trees or coated with oils, defied the storm. Their shelters shed water like the feathers of a duck. Their fires burned even when the world around them was soaked. The newcomers struggled to start fires, struggled to stay warm, struggled to keep their feet dry. Meanwhile, the indigenous peoples moved through the storm as if rain were merely another part of daily life, like light or shadow. This contrast says everything about the depth of environmental understanding native communities carried. But their capability did not emerge overnight. It came from centuries of trial and error. The rain became a teacher, and nature became a classroom. Elders watched how cedar-bark behaved after a fresh rainfall. Hunters noticed how animal fur repelled water. Basket makers experimented with pitch-to-seal containers. Children were taught not just to hum songs or learn stories, but to read the behavior of birds, the movement of clouds, the scent of the wind. A person who lived in such a world did not need a compass or weather app. They needed only their senses, sharpened by generations of accumulated wisdom. One of the most defining qualities of Native American life in rainy regions was the belief that the environment was not something to be conquered, it was something to be respected, listened to, understood. Rain was never the enemy. Rain was a blessing, a cleanser, a life giver. Rain fed the rivers where salmon returned faithfully each year. Rain nourished the forests that provided wood for canoes, planks, and woven capes. Rain, to many tribes, was a spiritual presence both gentle and powerful. To live in harmony with the rain was to understand the rhythm of the world. In the Pacific Northwest, rain shaped everything: the mythology, the landscapes, the architecture, the clothing, and the lifestyle. Massive cedar trees towered overhead, their bark soft and fibrous, easily shaped into clothing, ropes, and housing materials. The people learned that cedar bark, when properly prepared, repelled water astonishingly well. They discovered that its fibers expanded when wet, creating a tighter natural barrier. This was not random luck, it was experimentation refined through generations. They also discovered that certain types of moss held warmth even when damp, and that spruce root was flexible yet strong enough to weave into hats that shed water. Travelers from Europe, arriving in ships battered by storms, could not fathom how native tribes managed to keep fires going in endless rain, but what they didn't see was the preparation behind it. Indigenous peoples knew which woods burned hot, which woods burned slow, which woods produced resin that could ignite even when wet. They stored dry tinder long before the storms came. They wrapped fire bundles in hides that repelled water naturally. They built shelters angled perfectly to direct rainwater downward and outward. They positioned entrances away from prevailing winds. They layered their clothing based on animal behavior learned from hunters. Nothing was accidental. To fully grasp the brilliance of native rain survival, imagine standing in a forest where the canopy is thick enough to block much of the sky. Rain falls in constant light drips, creating a never-ending chorus on leaves and branches. Rivers overflow, fog hangs low, trails become slippery, muddy paths. Yet, despite all this, you see a community functioning seamlessly. Smoke rises steadily from longhouses, children play outside, hunters return with game, elders work on tools, fishermen craft nets. The rain does not stop life. It is simply woven into the fabric of their existence. These people belong to a world where every sound mattered. The soft patter of rain on cedar leaves could indicate changing wind patterns. The rhythm of raindrops on a river's surface could hint at rising water levels. The sudden quieting of birds could warn of a stronger storm approaching. The forest itself spoke, and the people listened. Their survival depended on it, but their respect for nature elevated it beyond mere practicality. It became a philosophy, a way of life grounded in observation, balance, and gratitude. The knowledge they held about staying dry in endless rain was not just about technology, it was about mindset. To them, dryness was not achieved by resisting the rain, it was achieved by working with the rain. Cedar bark capes were not tightly sealed garments meant to block every drop. Instead, they allowed air to flow so moisture could escape, while the outer fibers absorbed water and swelled, creating a breathable waterproof barrier. This balance prevented sweating and overheating, something modern materials still struggle to master. Indigenous people recognized that insulation, breathability, and protection must work together. They learned this not from books, but from watching the natural world. Animals, too, were profound teachers. Tribes observed how beavers maintained waterproof coats using oils. They saw how ducks shed water effortlessly with their feathers. They watched how wolves shook off rain and remained warm despite their fur becoming slightly damp. These animals provided not just inspiration, but material: fur, hides, and sinew, all used to create waterproof clothing long before the invention of synthetic fabrics. Communities living in heavy rainfall regions were not isolated either. They shared knowledge among neighboring tribes, traded waterproof goods, and taught techniques through storytelling. A story could carry instructions about how to weave fibers, how to treat hides, how to build shelters, or how to predict storms. Oral tradition was more accurate than modern memory because it was repeated constantly, taught to children early, and woven into cultural ceremonies. Knowledge was preserved not through paper, but through people. One of the most powerful aspects of indigenous rain survival was the spiritual dimension. Rain was often seen as a gift from the sky, a reminder of renewal and continuity. In many traditions, rain cleansed the earth and nourished the spirit. Rituals performed in the rain were believed to bring blessings, strength, and healing. Rain was woven into songs, dances, and stories, not as a threat, but as a companion. This emotional and spiritual acceptance of rain reshaped how people dealt with it physically. If rain was a blessing, then preparing for it was a form of respect. If storms were spirits passing through, then shelters were built to honor them, not resist them aggressively. Some early explorers wrote in journals about encountering native peoples who seemed unfazed by storms that left the visitors miserable. The observers could not understand how these communities stayed so dry and calm. They noted that indigenous clothing appeared simple but performed better than anything the explorers had. They described hats shaped perfectly to divert water, cloaks that swayed like tree bark, moccasins designed for wet trails, and fire-starting methods that seemed almost magical. But none of this was magic, it was knowledge. To survive in endless rain, you must understand the difference between being wet and being soaked. You must understand how the body retains heat, how clothing absorbs or repels moisture, how shelters breathe, how air flows, how materials behave under stress. Native Americans knew all of this instinctively, not because they were born knowing it, but because their lifestyle required that knowledge be learned from a young age. Children learned to identify dry bark beneath fallen logs. They learned to use natural oils found in plants. They learned to gather materials before storms, not during them. They learned how to layer clothing to trap warmth yet release moisture. By adulthood, they possessed a survival skill set far beyond what modern society expects from the average person. If you were to step back in time and walk into a village in the Pacific Northwest on a day of relentless rain, you would find a scene that might surprise you with how peaceful and calm it appeared. People worked at steady rhythms. Tools were crafted under open shelters, fish were dried under cover, cedar planks glistened with moisture, shedding water smoothly, fires crackled, protected by carefully arranged logs and overhangs. Children ran with woven hats on their heads, splashing through puddles. Elders told stories while smoothing bark strips. The storm did not disrupt life. It simply formed the backdrop of their everyday world. To outsiders, the rain in these regions felt like an obstacle, something uncomfortable, dreary, and restrictive. To native peoples, it was an element that sculpted identity, culture, and innovation. The ability to stay dry in endless rain was not just a skill, not just a technique, not just a matter of practicality. It was an expression of harmony with nature. It demonstrated that when humans live with the land rather than in defiance of it, they uncover solutions more elegant than anything manufactured. And so, when we look back at how Native Americans stayed dry for days in endless rain, what we truly see is a testament to human creativity, environmental respect, and generational wisdom. We see a world where people did not wait for modern technology to protect them. They became their own engineers, scientists, and guardians of knowledge. They learned from the land, and the land rewarded them with answers to questions we still struggle with today. To truly appreciate their ingenuity is to recognize the intelligence embedded in tradition, the engineering encoded in culture, and the deep respect for nature that defined their existence. Their story teaches us something profound, that survival is not a battle with nature, but a conversation with it. In the rain-soaked forests of North America, where rivers swelled and the canopy overhead dripped endlessly, the ability to remain dry was more than a comfort. It was a matter of survival. To modern eyes, it might seem impossible. Torrents of water falling from an unrelenting sky, the earth beneath turning into mud, streams overflowing their banks, and every surface coated in a glistening film of moisture. Yet, the indigenous peoples of the continent were not only able to endure these conditions, but they developed sophisticated systems to thrive within them. The ingenuity behind their rainproof clothing and protection from the elements was profound, a blend of material science, environmental observation, and trial and error experimentation that often rivaled modern technological achievements. Understanding how these communities stayed dry reveals a story of adaptation, intelligence, and cultural ingenuity that stretches back for centuries, long before the arrival of European settlers or the invention of synthetic fibers. In the dense, temperate rainforests of the Pacific Northwest, tribes such as the Tlingit, Haida, and Kwakwaka'wakwa faced some of the most challenging weather conditions on the continent. Rain could fall continuously for days or weeks, and the heavy moisture in the air made every surface slippery and every task more difficult. The first problem that arose was clothing. How could a community continue to hunt, gather, and travel through saturated terrain without getting soaked and risking hypothermia? Over generations, these tribes discovered that certain natural materials held remarkable waterproofing qualities. They identified the soft inner bark of cedar trees, which could be harvested, softened, and woven into thick capes. These capes, when layered and treated in specific ways, became astonishingly water-resistant. One of the most fascinating aspects of this clothing was how it interacted with water. The cedar fibers would swell as they absorbed moisture, tightening the weave and increasing the cape's resistance to water penetration. This meant that the longer it rained, the more effective the clothing became, what modern technology attempts to replicate with synthetic fibers, coatings, and lamination. Indigenous peoples achieved using nothing but the raw material of the forest. These cedar bark capes were not simply functional, they were carefully designed for mobility and comfort. The capes were lightweight, flexible, and allowed for air circulation, preventing the wearer from overheating during physical exertion. Hunters moving through dense forests could lift, bend, and navigate without restriction. Fishermen approaching a river to cast nets or spears could remain dry while standing in the flowing water. Every aspect of these garments demonstrated a deep understanding of both the environment and human anatomy. The capes were often complemented by hats woven from spruce roots, designed to form a conical shape that directed rain away from the face and shoulders. The design mirrored the way water slides off tree branches in the forest, a principle the tribes had observed over countless seasons. These hats were not decorative, they were tools of survival, crafted with precision, tested by experience, and perfected over generations. Even small details, such as the tightness of a weave or the angle of a brim, reflected meticulous attention to how rainwater moved and pooled in different conditions. In regions further inland and on the Great Plains, where rainfall was less continuous but could come in sudden, heavy bursts, different strategies emerged. Tribes in these areas relied heavily on the skins and furs of animals, particularly buffalo, deer, and seals. These materials were naturally water-resistant, and when treated with rendered fat, they became even more effective at repelling water. The application of fat or oil created a glossy surface that caused water to bead up and roll off, keeping the wearer dry for hours. Hunters and warriors who traveled long distances through rainstorms relied on these treated hides to remain functional and warm. The techniques for preparing the hides were complex. They required careful tanning, scraping, and curing, often involving multiple layers of fat, smoke, and stretching. The result was a garment that could withstand intense rainfall while still remaining flexible, breathable, and durable. In some accounts from early explorers, native hunters wearing these garments could remain on the move in torrential rain for an entire day without their clothing becoming saturated, a feat that astonished outsiders accustomed to struggling in wet weather with far less effective attire. Another remarkable feature of indigenous rainproof clothing was the understanding of layering. People learned that wearing multiple thin layers of cedar bark, hide, or woven plant fibers could be more effective than a single thick layer. The inner layers absorbed moisture slowly, while the outer layers repelled water and directed it away from the body. This created a dynamic system that maintained warmth and dryness simultaneously. Modern outdoor gear often relies on similar principles: moisture, wicking layers, breathable waterproof membranes. But indigenous peoples achieved the same results using only materials available in their environment. Every layer had a purpose, every fiber had a role, and the combination of these materials demonstrated not only practical skill, but also profound environmental intelligence. The preparation of these garments was itself a form of technological mastery. Harvesting cedar bark required precise timing. If cut too early, the fibers were brittle; too late, and they became overly coarse. The bark was softened by pounding, soaking, and drying in controlled ways, sometimes using smoke or sun drying techniques to achieve the desired texture. Weaving was done with meticulous care, ensuring that gaps were minimized and the structure could resist both wind and rain. Animal hides were treated with similar precision, using smoke and oils to enhance water resistance while preserving flexibility. Indigenous peoples experimented constantly, learning which combinations worked best for different climates and rainfall patterns. This was not improvisation, it was science, applied over generations with careful observation and record, keeping through memory and oral instruction. Rainproof clothing was not the only innovation. Footwear was equally essential. Moccasins, often crafted from soft hide and reinforced with stitching or plant fibers, were designed to shed water and provide traction on muddy or slick surfaces. Different regions developed specialized designs. In forested areas, soles were soft and flexible to navigate uneven, wet terrain. In swampy regions, double-layered moccasins prevented water from seeping into the feet. In mountainous or rocky regions, thicker soles protected from moisture and sharp surfaces. The construction of these shoes reflected a sophisticated understanding of how water interacts with surfaces and materials, knowledge that was acquired through observation of both the environment and the behavior of animals. Hunters, travelers, and warriors all depended on this footwear for mobility, safety, and comfort. A well-crafted pair of moccasins could make the difference between a successful hunting expedition and a failed one due to wet, cold feet. Clothing and footwear were only part of the equation. Indigenous peoples understood that keeping dry required a comprehensive approach that included storage, travel, and shelter. Water-resistant bags and containers were crafted from woven plant fibers and coated with pine pitch, allowing food, medicine, and tools to remain dry during long journeys through rain-soaked landscapes. These containers were designed to be lightweight yet durable, reflecting the same principles seen in clothing: protection, breathability, and flexibility. The same attention to detail extended to every aspect of daily life, from the construction of shelters to the maintenance of fires and the management of water resources. Every innovation was interconnected, creating an ecosystem of survival that allowed communities to flourish even under continuous rainfall. The cultural dimension of rainproof clothing cannot be overlooked. Garments were often decorated with symbolic patterns, colors, and designs that conveyed identity, status, or spiritual significance. These embellishments were not merely aesthetic. They reflected an understanding of the interconnectedness of utility, culture, and ritual. For example, certain capes or hats might be worn during ceremonial events, combining practical water protection with cultural expression. The act of preparing, weaving, and wearing these garments reinforced social bonds and passed knowledge from one generation to the next. Children observed and assisted in the creation of these items, learning techniques that were vital for survival while simultaneously internalizing cultural values and spiritual lessons. One of the most impressive aspects of indigenous rainproof technology was the adaptability of their clothing. People did not rely on a single solution for all weather conditions. Instead, they developed systems that could be modified depending on the intensity of rain, the season, and the specific activity. Hunters moving through dense forests might wear multiple layers of cedar bark with a spruce root hat, while fishers standing in river currents could rely on oiled hides and layered capes. Travelers navigating long distances combined different materials to maximize water resistance without sacrificing mobility. Each combination was tested in the field, refined through experience, and passed down to others. This adaptability illustrates the dynamic relationship indigenous peoples had with their environment. They were not static in their approach, but constantly learning, observing, and innovating. The effectiveness of these techniques was often stunning. European explorers and settlers frequently commented on the remarkable ability of Native Americans to remain dry and comfortable during conditions that left outsiders soaked and miserable. Ships' crews struggled to maintain fires, dry clothing, and supplies in relentless rain, while indigenous hunters and fishers moved through storms with confidence. Observers noted that the clothing seemed simple at first glance, yet performed at a level far beyond the expectations of the time. The ingenuity lay not in complexity, but in understanding the materials, the environment, and the human body. Indigenous peoples achieved what modern technology would later attempt to replicate with synthetics, coatings, and waterproof fabrics, all using only the resources immediately available to them. Beyond the practical, there was also a philosophical aspect to rainproof clothing. By learning to stay dry and comfortable in endless rain, indigenous communities cultivated a mindset of resilience, patience, and harmony with nature. The rain was not a nuisance to be avoided, but an integral part of life. Preparing for and responding to rainfall was a way of participating in the natural world, acknowledging its power, and adapting intelligently to its challenges. This approach fostered a sense of confidence, independence, and skill that was embedded in the culture itself. Young people grew up learning to observe, to anticipate, and to respond appropriately, developing both practical abilities and an intimate connection with the land. In addition, rainproof clothing played a crucial role in social organization and mobility. Communities needed to move efficiently between seasonal settlements, travel for trade, hunt in distant regions, and gather resources. Without reliable protection from the elements, these activities would have been far more dangerous and less effective. By mastering the principles of water-resistant clothing and gear, Native Americans ensured that entire societies could operate even under the harshest conditions. This knowledge was shared, taught, and reinforced through storytelling, mentorship, and ritual, creating a resilient social fabric intertwined with technological expertise. The legacy of these innovations extends beyond survival. It represents a profound understanding of the natural world, an ability to extract maximum utility from available resources, and an ethic of sustainability and adaptation. By carefully selecting, preparing, and combining materials, indigenous peoples created clothing that could last for years, repairable and reusable, without damaging the environment. Their methods highlight a balance between functionality, durability, and ecological stewardship, a balance that modern societies still strive to achieve with advanced materials and industrial processes. In essence, the rainproof clothing of Native Americans exemplifies a holistic approach to problem solving. It demonstrates observation, experimentation, material science, environmental awareness, and cultural integration, all woven together seamlessly. Each cape, hat, moccasin, and garment tells a story not only of survival, but of intelligence, creativity, and harmony with the natural world. Understanding these techniques offers a glimpse into a world, that sees humans as participants in nature rather than opponents of it. A world, where innovation is guided by necessity, experience, and respect for the forces that shape life. By examining the intricate methods used to stay dry in endless rain, we begin to appreciate the extraordinary depth of indigenous knowledge. These communities solved problems that challenged modern explorers, engineers, and survivalists, doing so with materials drawn from the land itself. The sophistication of their solutions, combined with their adaptability and cultural integration, reveals a level of intelligence and ingenuity that is often underestimated. What may appear simple or rustic at first glance is, in reality, the product of centuries of careful observation, testing, and refinement. Through cedar-bark capes that swell with moisture, spruce root hats that channel rain away, and oiled hides that repel water while remaining flexible, Native Americans created a system of rainproof clothing that was effective, sustainable, and deeply connected to the environment. Every thread, every fiber, every layer was the result of knowledge passed down through generations, continuously refined and adapted. This was not clothing for fashion or convenience. It was clothing for survival, skill, and life itself. In a broader sense, their ability to remain dry in endless rain exemplifies a guiding principle of human ingenuity. To understand the problem thoroughly, work with the available resources, and create solutions that are elegant, effective, and harmonious with the environment. It is a lesson in observation, creativity, and respect for the world around us. Indigenous peoples of North America did not simply survive in wet landscapes, they mastered them. They transformed potential adversity into opportunity, using their intimate knowledge of materials, weather patterns, and human physiology to navigate storms with grace, resilience, and intelligence. Their rainproof clothing stands as a testament to the brilliance of human adaptation, the power of tradition, and the timeless value of learning from the natural world. For those living in the wettest regions of North America, the ability to stay dry was not the only challenge presented by endless rain. Perhaps even more critical was the mastery of fire, a skill that determined whether a community could eat, stay warm, and survive the cold, damp nights. In a landscape where rain could fall for days without ceasing, where the air was thick with mist and every stick and leaf was soaked, fire became a precious resource. Without it, hypothermia was a constant threat, cooked meals were impossible, and the very fabric of daily life would unravel. Yet Native Americans, with a combination of skill, preparation, and intimate knowledge of their environment, developed techniques to create, maintain, and use fire even under relentless rainfall. Their methods were sophisticated, highly adaptive, and often far ahead of anything outsiders had encountered. They turned what seemed like an impossible task into a routine practice, a testament to their ingenuity, resilience, and deep understanding of nature. The mastery of fire in endless rain began long before a single spark was struck. Indigenous communities were meticulous in their preparation. They understood that survival in such wet conditions required foresight. The first step was the creation of fire bundles, compact, waterproof bundles of tinder that could ignite even under adverse conditions. These bundles were made from materials that had been carefully selected for their flammability and durability. Punkwood, a type of decaying tree wood, was prized for its ability to smolder slowly without extinguishing. Cattail fluff, shredded inner bark, and dry grasses were also commonly used. These materials were layered, tightly packed, and then wrapped in animal hides or bark strips to protect them from moisture. The wrapping ensured that the tinder remained dry even when carried through rain, soaked forests, or across flooded terrain. The creation of fire bundles was an art form combining knowledge of materials, timing, and environmental conditions, ensuring that a spark could always produce flame when needed. Children were taught from a young age to prepare and maintain these bundles, ensuring that the skill and the survival advantage it conferred was passed down through generations. The choice of wood for the main fire was equally critical. Not all wood burns the same, and not all wood performs well under wet conditions. Indigenous peoples observed which types of trees produced the most resin, which woods ignited quickly, and which burned steadily even when damp. Pine, spruce, and fir were highly valued because of their resin-rich properties. Resin acts as a natural accelerant, allowing wood to catch fire even when exposed to humidity or light rain. Dead branches from high in the canopy were often used because they were sheltered from direct rainfall, providing naturally drier material. In addition, the layering of firewood was methodical. Smaller kindling was carefully stacked to ensure airflow, while larger logs were arranged to create sustained heat once the initial flame had taken hold. Firemaking was not haphazard. It was a controlled process designed to maximize success in the most difficult conditions. One of the most innovative techniques used by Native Americans was the top-down fire. Unlike the fires familiar to most people today, which are built from the bottom upward, this method involved placing larger logs at the bottom and smaller, drier material on top. When lit, the flame slowly consumed the top layers, gradually igniting the larger logs below. This approach offered multiple advantages, especially in wet environments. The top layers protected the flame from being extinguished by splashing rain, while the gradual ignition ensured that the fire would burn steadily and predictably. This technique was particularly useful during prolonged storms, when maintaining consistent heat was crucial for cooking, warmth, and morale. The method reflects an acute understanding of combustion, airflow, and heat transfer, all achieved through observation and experience rather than formal scientific study. Ignition sources themselves were carefully managed. Flint and steel, friction-based fire drills, and other traditional tools were employed with great skill. Knowing the conditions under which each method worked best was vital. Certain types of friction-based fire drills, for example, functioned more effectively with particular woods or fibers, and practitioners understood which combinations produced the quickest ignition. They also developed techniques for shielding sparks from rain or wind, such as building temporary shelters over the ignition point, or using small pieces of bark to channel heat and flame. The ability to create fire was not simply about skill with a tool. It required strategic thinking, preparation, and precise timing. It was a holistic practice, integrating knowledge of materials, environmental conditions, and human physiology. The placement of fires within shelters or camps was another area of innovation. Understanding that wind and rain could extinguish a flame, indigenous peoples designed their lean tas, longhouses, and temporary shelters with openings and angles that channeled air while protecting flames. Overhangs made from bark, angled walls, and raised hearths ensured that fires burned efficiently while reducing the risk of accidental extinguishment. Some communities even built their hearths partially underground or in recessed areas to protect them from wind-driven rain. The placement of fire was as strategic as its creation, reflecting a deep understanding of physics, architecture, and meteorology. Fires were not just survival tools. They were carefully integrated into the environment and social structure, serving as centers for cooking, warmth, social gathering, and ritual practice. The social and cultural dimension of fire cannot be understated. Fire-making was often a communal activity, reinforcing social bonds and ensuring that knowledge was shared. Elders taught younger members how to recognize suitable materials, how to prepare tinder bundles, and how to construct fires that could withstand storms. Mistakes could be fatal, so instruction was meticulous, hands-on, and constant. The process of creating fire also had spiritual significance. In many traditions, fire was seen as a sacred element, a bridge between the physical and spiritual worlds. Maintaining it during relentless rain was not only practical but also symbolic. It represented life, resilience, and the continuity of the community. The act of building, tending, and protecting a fire in the rain became a lesson in patience, observation, and respect for nature. Another key aspect of fire survival was the use of natural accelerants and protective materials. Rich woods were often supplemented with pine pitch, dried grasses, or small amounts of animal fat to ensure rapid ignition. These materials were carefully stored in waterproof containers or wrapped in bark to remain usable in wet conditions. The knowledge of which combinations worked best was accumulated over generations. It required understanding how different substances interacted with moisture, heat, and airflow. This chemical intuition, combined with practical skill, allowed communities to maintain reliable sources of heat even during the heaviest storms. The integration of fire into mobility strategies was equally impressive. Travelers and hunters often carried small, portable fire bundles, wrapped to withstand rain, enabling them to cook or warm themselves while on long journeys. These portable fires were critical for survival during hunting trips or migrations when access to dry wood or shelter was limited. Knowing how to construct a temporary fire in a wet environment required both creativity and deep environmental knowledge. For example, selecting a naturally sheltered spot, such as under a dense canopy or between rocks, could make the difference between a successful ignition and a failure. Each fire, whether in a longhouse, a temporary camp, or a forest clearing, was the result of careful planning, observation, and application of accumulated wisdom. The resilience of indigenous firemaking techniques is further illustrated by accounts from early explorers and settlers. Europeans, accustomed to dry tinder and predictable weather, were often astonished at the consistency and reliability of fires maintained by native communities in torrential rain. Where outsiders struggled to ignite a single flame, indigenous hunters and fishers carried multiple fire bundles that could be lit in succession, ensuring warmth, cooked food, and safety at all times. This consistency reflected not only technical skill, but also foresight and planning. Fire was treated as a critical resource, protected and maintained continuously. Fire also played a role in cultural and ritual practices. Ceremonial fires were often built to remain burning through rain and wind, symbolizing endurance, renewal, and the presence of spiritual forces. Certain dances, songs, and rituals were performed around these fires, reinforcing the communal and spiritual significance of maintaining flame in challenging conditions. The act of tending a fire, ensuring that it remained lit, and protecting it from the elements was a form of cultural expression as much as a practical necessity. In this way, fire served multiple roles. It was warmth, sustenance, protection, spiritual symbol, and a medium for social cohesion. The importance of fire extended to the processing and storage of food. Cooking in wet conditions required careful management of heat and flame. Indigenous peoples learned how to construct fire pits that burned steadily despite rain, allowing meat to be smoked or roasted and plants to be dried. Food preservation depended on this ability to generate reliable heat, particularly in regions where rainfall made traditional drying or smoking techniques more challenging. Failure to maintain fire could result in food spoilage or loss, which could jeopardize the survival of a community during long periods of inclement weather. The techniques developed for firemaking were therefore integral to broader survival strategies, encompassing nutrition, health, and mobility. In addition to cooking, fire was used to dry clothing, blankets, and other materials that had become damp. Indigenous peoples understood that maintaining dry clothing was essential to prevent illness and maintain mobility. Fires were carefully positioned to maximize warmth while minimizing the risk of sparks or flames damaging valuable garments. Smoky fires could also serve to repel insects and provide signals for communication across distances. Every aspect of fire use was interconnected with the broader ecosystem of survival, from shelter and clothing to food and health. Indigenous peoples also developed an acute understanding of microenvironments for fire placement. In forests, they observed areas where tree canopies provided natural shelter from rain, where wind patterns created pockets of calm air, and where the earth was naturally dry. Fires were often built in these locations to maximize the likelihood of success. This careful observation and application of environmental knowledge demonstrate a level of sophistication that rivals modern survival science. The ability to combine observation, planning, and skill ensured that fire could be maintained consistently, even in conditions that would confound an untrained person. Portable fire techniques were complemented by the creation of semi-permanent fires at camps and settlements. These fires were constructed to withstand wind-driven rain and could be reignited quickly using stored tinder or embers. Communities often maintained multiple fires, ensuring redundancy in case one failed. The strategic placement of these fires within settlements provided warmth, allowed cooking to continue during storms, and created a sense of security and stability. The management of fire was an ongoing process, requiring vigilance, coordination, and expertise. It was an activity that shaped the rhythm of daily life and reinforced communal bonds. Finally, the lessons learned from centuries of experience with fire and rain informed other aspects of survival, including shelter design, clothing preparation, and travel planning. The principles of protection, airflow, and heat management used in firemaking were mirrored in longhouse construction, lean-to shelters, and clothing design. Indigenous peoples understood that every element of their environment was interconnected. Mastering fire meant mastering a complex system that encompassed weather, materials, human physiology, and social organization. It was not simply about keeping a flame alive. It was about creating a sustainable system of survival that could withstand the most challenging conditions nature could offer. Through the meticulous preparation of tinder bundles, the strategic selection of resin-rich wood, the innovative top-down fire method, and the integration of fire into daily life, indigenous peoples demonstrated unparalleled ingenuity. Their ability to maintain fire in relentless rain was not a matter of luck, but the result of centuries of observation, experimentation, and cultural transmission. Fire was both a practical necessity and a symbol of human ingenuity, resilience, and harmony with nature. By mastering fire in wet conditions, Native Americans ensured that their communities could thrive, travel, and sustain themselves even in the face of unrelenting storms. The mastery of fire in the rain also underscores a broader lesson about human adaptation and innovation. Indigenous peoples were not passive observers of their environment. They were active participants, learning from the behavior of plants, animals, wind, and rain to create systems that supported life. Their techniques were sustainable, effective, and deeply connected to the world around them. Modern society often overlooks these achievements, yet the principles they employed, careful observation, preparation, material knowledge, and strategic planning, remain relevant today. Understanding and appreciating these skills allows us to recognize the extraordinary intelligence and creativity embedded in indigenous cultures. By examining the ways Native Americans created and maintained fire during endless rain, we gain insight into a world where survival required both technical skill and environmental wisdom. The ability to keep flames burning under such conditions represents a profound understanding of the natural world, human physiology, and community coordination. It is a testament to ingenuity, resilience, and the capacity of humans to harmonize with, rather than simply endure, the forces of nature. Fire was more than a tool. It was a lifeline, a cultural touchstone, and a symbol of human mastery in a world defined by rain and relentless moisture. The story of indigenous firemaking in wet conditions illustrates a universal principle. Survival is not simply about resistance to nature, but about learning, adapting, and working with it. The techniques developed for maintaining fire, from tinder preparation to shelter placement, reflect a holistic approach to problem solving that integrates material knowledge, environmental awareness, and social cohesion. Native Americans did not merely react to the rain. They anticipated it, prepared for it, and transformed it into an element that could be managed and used to their advantage. Their mastery of fire in the rain is a profound example of human ingenuity, resilience, and the enduring power of traditional knowledge. For indigenous peoples living in the rain-soaked landscapes of North America, survival was about far more than staying dry while walking or hunting. The true test came when a community had to maintain daily life under relentless rainfall. Cooking, sleeping, gathering, and social interaction all depended on the ability to create spaces that could withstand the constant moisture of the environment. The ingenuity displayed in the construction of rainproof shelters and camps is a testament not only to practical skill, but also to an intimate understanding of natural materials, weather patterns, and human needs. In regions where rain could persist for weeks on end, shelter was not a temporary convenience. It was a critical lifeline, shaping the rhythm of life, the structure of communities, and the culture itself. What modern builders and engineers often attempt to achieve with concrete, metal, and synthetic coatings, Native Americans achieved with wood, bark, stone, and an intuitive understanding of nature. In the Pacific Northwest, where rainfall was frequent and often heavy, longhouses became central to community life. These structures were built using massive cedar planks, which were not only abundant, but also naturally resistant to moisture and rot. The cedar was carefully selected, cut, and treated to ensure durability. Smoke, hardening, a process by which planks were exposed to controlled smoke over time, added an additional layer of protection against water, insects, and decay. The arrangement of planks was methodical, overlapping in such a way that water naturally ran off, preventing seepage into the living space. The longhouse was more than a shelter. It was a complex system of architecture that integrated knowledge of airflow, heat, and structural stability, all tailored to withstand the challenges of an environment defined by relentless precipitation. These longhouses were not isolated structures. They were part of a broader village ecosystem. Multiple houses were arranged with pathways and communal spaces designed to facilitate movement even in wet conditions. Elevated walkways made from planks or tightly bound logs allowed people to navigate muddy or flooded areas without compromising their mobility. Central hearths were constructed with careful consideration of ventilation and drainage, allowing smoke to rise efficiently while ensuring that water could not extinguish the fire. Every element of longhouse design reflected an understanding of how rain interacted with surfaces, structures, and human activity. In regions where permanent longhouses were less common, temporary shelters were engineered with equal ingenuity. Lintas, often built with a simple A-frame structure, used bark, reeds, or planks to create roofs that efficiently channeled rain away from the interior. The angle of the roof was carefully calculated to ensure rapid runoff, while the selection of materials maximized water resistance. In some areas, shelters were constructed using flexible branches woven together to create walls and roofs, then covered with bark or moss to repel water. These structures could be assembled quickly in preparation for storms and dismantled or moved as needed. The ability to construct a reliable temporary shelter was crucial for hunters, travelers, and fishing parties, allowing them to maintain safety and functionality in unpredictable weather. The integration of natural features into shelter design was another hallmark of indigenous ingenuity. In forested regions, communities often built shelters against hillsides or within natural clearings that offered protection from prevailing winds and channeled water away from living areas. Overhanging cliffs, dense stands of trees, and natural depressions in the terrain were used strategically to reduce exposure to rainfall. The placement of a shelter was as important as its construction. Indigenous peoples understood that environmental context could enhance or undermine even the most carefully built structure. Observation and experience guided every decision, from the choice of site to the arrangement of materials, ensuring that shelters were not merely functional but optimally suited to the local climate. In the Arctic and subarctic regions, where rain often came mixed with sleet and snow, indigenous peoples developed specialized shelters to maintain warmth and dryness in extreme conditions. Sealskin tents, known for their remarkable water resistance, were a cornerstone of survival. These tents were stretched over flexible wooden frames and coated with oils or fats to enhance waterproofing. The materials were carefully maintained to ensure longevity, and the construction allowed for efficient ventilation to prevent condensation from dampening the interior. The design was both portable and resilient, enabling nomadic groups to move with the seasons while maintaining a stable, dry living environment. These tents were complemented by sophisticated techniques for insulation, such as layering furs, arranging sleeping areas above the cold ground, and positioning shelters to take advantage of sunlight and wind patterns. Every detail reflected an understanding of thermodynamics, moisture control, and human comfort in harsh climates. Inside shelters, water management continued to be a primary concern. Hearths were often constructed with raised platforms or stone bases to prevent water from pooling beneath the fire. Drainage channels were sometimes dug around shelters to direct rainwater away from entrances and living spaces. Floor coverings made from bark, mats, or layered plant materials kept the interior dry and insulated. In communal longhouses, interior partitions allowed for the creation of dry zones where food could be prepared, tools stored, and children kept warm. The interior design of shelters was an extension of the principles used in clothing and footwear: protection from moisture, airflow management, and practical functionality tailored to the specific environmental conditions. The construction of shelters was also deeply intertwined with cultural and spiritual practices. Building a longhouse or temporary shelter was not merely a practical activity, it was a ritualized process that reinforced social cohesion and cultural values. Ceremonies often marked the selection of materials, the laying of foundational beams, or the completion of a structure. Elders guided younger members through the process, ensuring that technical skills and cultural knowledge were transmitted together. The act of creating a shelter became a form of education, a way to preserve tradition, and a method of reinforcing the community's relationship with the environment. Waterproofing and rain resilience were practical necessities, but the methods used to achieve them were inseparable from the community's social and spiritual fabric. The innovation in shelter design extended to storage and auxiliary structures as well. Communities constructed raised platforms and racks for food storage, ensuring that grains, dried meat, and other provisions remained dry even during prolonged storms. Containers made from woven plant fibers, often sealed with pine pitch, complemented these structures, allowing food and supplies to remain protected from both rain and pests. In coastal areas, storage sheds and workspaces were often positioned near water sources for convenience, with roofs and drainage systems designed to handle heavy precipitation. These systems reflect a sophisticated understanding of logistics, environmental dynamics, and the interaction between shelter, human activity, and the surrounding landscape. Mobility considerations were also critical in rainproof shelter design. In regions where communities were semi-nomadic, the ability to construct and deconstruct shelters quickly was essential. Lightweight frames made from bendable wood, easily harvested bark, and flexible plant fibers allowed for rapid assembly. Materials were often chosen for their dual-purpose qualities: branches that could be bent without breaking, bark that could be stripped in sheets, and moss or reeds that provided insulation while remaining light. These materials allowed communities to move efficiently between seasonal settlements, maintaining dry living conditions without sacrificing mobility or speed. The design of shelters was therefore closely linked to lifestyle, trade routes, hunting patterns, and seasonal cycles. The aesthetic dimension of shelters further highlights the integration of functionality and culture. While the primary goal was to protect from rain, many structures incorporated artistic elements, such as carvings on planks, painted designs, or symbolic motifs woven into bark coverings. These embellishments were not merely decorative, they communicated social identity, clan affiliation, and spiritual beliefs. The combination of practical engineering and cultural expression demonstrates the holistic approach Native Americans took toward shelter, where utility, identity, and environmental harmony coexisted seamlessly. Even in extreme weather, the structures were functional works of art, embodying centuries of accumulated knowledge. Rainproof shelters were also essential in supporting firemaking and heat management. The careful positioning of openings, hearths, and smoke vents allowed fires to burn efficiently even during storms, while minimizing the risk of water extinguishing the flame. In some regions, shelters were constructed to channel airflow strategically, ensuring that smoke exited cleanly while fresh air entered, maintaining oxygen flow and warmth. The integration of fire within shelters required both technical and environmental knowledge, demonstrating an understanding of thermodynamics, combustion, and ventilation that was highly advanced. Fire and shelter were complementary systems, each enhancing the effectiveness of the other, creating safe and functional living spaces even in relentless rain. The interdependence of clothing, footwear, and shelter further exemplifies the comprehensive approach to rainproof living. A well-constructed shelter complemented rainproof clothing, while clothing allowed people to navigate wet terrain to build and maintain structures. Footwear provided traction and stability, ensuring mobility even on slippery surfaces. Fire provided warmth and the ability to dry materials. Together, these systems formed an integrated survival strategy, where each component reinforced the others. The knowledge required to create these systems was passed down through generations, refined through observation and experience, and embedded in the social and cultural fabric of communities. In addition to the practical and cultural dimensions, rainproof shelter construction also required careful attention to material sustainability. Indigenous peoples were acutely aware of the ecological balance of their environment. Materials were harvested selectively to avoid damaging trees or depleting local resources. Bark was stripped carefully to allow trees to heal. Branches were harvested without compromising future growth, and plant fibers were collected in ways that ensured continued regeneration. This sustainable approach allowed communities to maintain reliable shelters over generations without degrading their environment. The use of renewable, biodegradable materials contrasts sharply with modern construction practices that often rely on non-renewable or environmentally harmful resources, highlighting the sophistication and foresight inherent in indigenous engineering. The effectiveness of these shelters was frequently noted by early European observers, who marveled at the ability of indigenous communities to maintain dry, warm, and functional living spaces even during prolonged storms. Unlike European constructions of the time, which often suffered from leaks, rot, or structural failure, native shelters were resilient, adaptable, and harmonized with their surroundings. The combination of material selection, architectural design, environmental integration, and cultural knowledge produced structures that were highly functional and aesthetically coherent, capable of withstanding some of the most challenging weather conditions on the continent. Beyond individual dwellings, rainproof construction techniques extended to communal spaces, storage facilities, and ceremonial structures. Villages were organized with drainage in mind, pathways were elevated or reinforced, and community centers were built to protect important resources from water damage. These designs reflected a systemic understanding of water management, risk reduction, and communal resilience. In effect, indigenous communities created entire settlements optimized for wet environments, where every building, path, and platform served a purpose in maintaining functionality during endless rainfall. Ultimately, the construction of rainproof shelters demonstrates a remarkable blend of engineering, environmental science, cultural expression, and sustainability. Indigenous peoples observed, learned, and applied principles that allowed them not only to survive, but to thrive in environments where rain was constant and sometimes oppressive. Their solutions were elegant, adaptive, and interconnected, reflecting a holistic understanding of the natural world and human needs. Every shelter, whether a temporary lean-to or a massive cedar longhouse, was a manifestation of centuries of accumulated knowledge, creativity, and respect for nature. By studying these shelters, we gain insight into a world where humans do not dominate nature but work with it. We see a culture that values preparation, observation, skill, and social cohesion. we witness the integration of survival, art, and spiritual practice, creating spaces that protect, sustain, and inspire. Indigenous rainproof shelters are more than functional structures. They are symbols of human ingenuity, resilience, and harmony with the environment. They remind us that in a world dominated by rain, survival depended not on avoiding nature, but on understanding it, respecting it, and designing intelligently in response to its challenges. Through these shelters, Native Americans transformed relentless rain from an obstacle into a force that shaped culture, community, and life itself. For Native Americans, life in a landscape of endless rain required more than staying dry at home or keeping a fire alive. Survival demanded mobility, the ability to travel and work effectively in constant wet conditions, often across vast and challenging terrain. The rain was relentless, transforming forests into slippery labyrinths, rivers into treacherous torrents, and plains into muddy expanses. Yet indigenous peoples were not only able to navigate these conditions, they thrived in them. Their strategies for traveling, hunting, fishing, gathering, and trading in such environments were sophisticated, adaptive, and meticulously honed over generations. Understanding these techniques reveals a level of environmental intelligence and practical ingenuity that is remarkable, blending knowledge of terrain, weather, materials, and human physiology into an interconnected system of survival and efficiency. Traveling in continuous rain began with preparation. Indigenous peoples understood that wet conditions increased fatigue, risk, and danger, so journeys were carefully planned. Routes were chosen based on natural cover, terrain, and drainage patterns. High ground was preferred over low-lying areas prone to flooding. Dense forests offered shelter from wind-driven rain, while natural clearings provided visibility and safe footing. Seasonal knowledge was critical. Certain trails became impassable during prolonged storms, while others offered predictable conditions. Hunters and traders memorized these pathways, passing down detailed instructions and strategies through oral tradition. This knowledge was more than a map. It was a guide to interacting with the environment, anticipating challenges, and navigating them safely. Footwear and clothing played an essential role in enabling mobility during rain. Water-resistant moccasins, cedar-bark leggings, and oiled hides provided traction, protection, and warmth. Soft soles allowed hunters to move quietly through wet forests while maintaining grip on slippery moss, roots, and rocks. Layered clothing managed both moisture and body heat, preventing the exhaustion and illness that could result from prolonged exposure to rain. The integration of clothing and footwear with travel strategy demonstrates the holistic approach indigenous peoples took to mobility. Every detail, from material selection to fit and layering, was informed by practical experience and environmental observation. In heavily forested or swampy regions, the challenge of wet terrain required ingenuity beyond clothing. Indigenous peoples developed techniques for crossing rivers, navigating marshes, and traversing muddy slopes. Log bridges, partially submerged stepping stones, and corded walkways were used to create stable paths over difficult terrain. In some areas, hollow, stout logs and planks were placed to serve as temporary bridges, while in others, mats woven from reeds or bark provided a dry surface for walking. These innovations were lightweight, portable, and reusable, reflecting both engineering skill and a deep understanding of the environment. Travelers learned to read the landscape, recognizing subtle cues such as soil saturation, water flow, and vegetation patterns to select the safest route. Mobility in the rain was therefore not only a physical challenge but a cognitive one, requiring constant assessment, observation, and adaptation. Watercraft was another essential element of travel in wet environments. Rivers, lakes, and coastal waterways provided vital corridors for transportation, trade, and subsistence. Dugout canoes, constructed from hollowed cedar logs or birch bark, were lightweight, durable, and remarkably water-resistant. These canoes were shaped to handle currents, carry significant loads, and allow for maneuverability in challenging conditions. Knowledge of watercraft extended to understanding tides, river flow, and seasonal changes in water levels, ensuring that journeys were safe and efficient. Paddling techniques were adapted to minimize exposure to rain and maximize speed, while waterproofing strategies, such as coating seams with pitch or resin, kept the interior dry even during storms. Water travel allowed communities to maintain communication, trade, and hunting activities despite unrelenting rainfall, making it a central component of life in these regions. Fishing and hunting in the rain required a blend of skill, observation, and specialized equipment. Fish traps, nets, and spears were designed to function effectively even in flooded rivers and streams. Fishermen understood how rain affected water levels, fish behavior, and currents, allowing them to anticipate where fish would be concentrated. In some areas, fish weirs were built to divert and concentrate fish into accessible channels, minimizing the need for wading in dangerous currents. Hunters adapted to slippery terrain and reduced visibility, using knowledge of animal tracks, sounds, and behaviors to locate prey. The rain altered scent trails and footprints, and indigenous trackers learned to interpret these changes with precision. The tools and strategies used were tailored to maximize efficiency while minimizing exposure to the elements, allowing communities to maintain a steady food supply even during prolonged storms. Gathering plant resources in constant rain required similar ingenuity. Wild berries, roots, medicinal herbs, and edible plants often grew in areas prone to flooding or mud accumulation. Indigenous gatherers developed techniques for identifying safe, accessible patches and for moving through saturated environments without damaging the plants or themselves. Raised platforms, woven mats, and improvised walkways allowed gatherers to collect resources without sinking into the mud. Knowledge of plant growth cycles, soil moisture, and rainfall patterns enabled communities to predict when and where resources would be available, ensuring successful harvests even in adverse conditions. Gathering in the rain was a practice that combined environmental intelligence with careful planning, physical skill, and adaptability. Storage and transport of resources collected during rain required additional consideration. Waterproof containers made from bark, plant fibers, or treated animal hides allowed food, medicinal plants, and tools to remain dry during transit. When traveling long distances, bundles were carefully packed to prevent water damage, and routes were chosen to minimize exposure to streams, puddles, and flooded areas. The integration of storage solutions with travel strategies reflects a sophisticated understanding of logistics, resource management, and environmental adaptation. Communities were able to maintain mobility without compromising the integrity of their supplies, ensuring continuity of life even under persistent rainfall. The social dimension of traveling in rain cannot be overlooked. Journeys were often communal, with groups moving together to share resources, maintain safety, and support one another in challenging conditions. Coordination and communication were essential, particularly when navigating rivers, forests, or wetlands. Elders led groups, teaching young members how to read the terrain, interpret weather patterns, and respond to hazards. Songs, chants, and signals